Hey guys, so as usual, I wanted to provide a recap of some of the decks that I've topped in the regional level events in the past couple of weekends, but also use this time as an opportunity to recap the entire format overall post-January ban list, because hopefully we do get that new list soon and we can sort of use this as a time to reflect. Also, as usual, definitely go check out my discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles, Yu-Gi-Oh! Sleeves, and other supplies. Links and discount codes in the description below. And as always, definitely a shout out to Ivan as well as YGOProduct.com for keeping track of all these regional level tops. Okay, so for looking at the past couple of weekends from end of March to beginning of April, this is sort of like the pie chart breakdown for regional level events only. As we saw in the last regional report, Snake Eye continues to sort of overtake that number 1 spot now. You know, it's no longer Fire King Snake Eye. That's the most dominant deck. And then you, of course, have Voiceless Voice being third. That's been pretty constant since the release. And branded Despia, Kashtira has been, as well as Thunder even, has been pretty stable. And Stun has been seeing a rise. I actually did a video separately on this in terms of Rise of Stun decks. Some of the most played floodgates and other cards in these lists, so you can certainly go check that out. But you know, hopefully Stun gets kind of hit as well on this next ban list whenever it comes out. So now, if you were to rewind back to the first couple of weekends worth of regional level events post January ban list, January 1st, so which by the way is still the same list that we're using, Konami. So please give us a new one. But anyways, it's kind of funny to see that Rescue Ace at that point was, of course, the most represented deck. It was really the best deck going into that format as well. And so because of that kind of fall, I was kind of interested in how some of these top decks at the beginning of January fared as we progressed through the format. So then you see with Fire King, at the beginning, right after the ban list, but before Maze of Millennia came out, which is of course when Bonfire came out, it was still pretty decent in terms of representation. Of course, Rescue Ace again was the most represented deck, but the moment Phantom Nightmare became legal, where of course Poplar and some like Promethean Princess, Snake Eye, Fire King really shot up in terms of representation, taking most of the top cut at regional level events, YCS level events. But over time, we've seen this kind of decline just because now players have actually opted to play pure Snake Eye instead. So next we have Rescue Ace, which you already talked about. In the beginning of the January ban list format, it was the most represented deck, but over time, especially after Phantom Nightmare, where people just opted to play Snake Eye Fire King or pure Snake Eye, Rescue Ace really fell down hard, even though there wasn't anything really wrong with Rescue Ace. And I mean, whatever this ban list comes, if they do make a lot of direct hits to Snake Eye, who knows, but if they do, maybe Rescue Ace actually kind of comes back as well. I don't think we can really count on them, or rather count them out yet. And then you have something like Branded Despia. This has been, for the most part, very stable throughout this entire period. You can even argue it's gone up quite a bit, a little bit on a slower pace. I think it's pretty solid. It has a decent Snake Eye, Fire King matchup. So I think that's where it's kind of held its ground. But of course, with this balance, Sanctifier is probably getting banned. And at the very least, that Gimmick Lock, once that's gone, who knows what Branded Despia's representation will be. I do think that it will still be around as long as Branded Fusion isn't directly hit too much. And then you also have Kashtira, which is kind of similar to the lines of Branded Despia in terms of how sort of stable it's been throughout this entire format post-January ban list. Even in the most recent week, I actually saw a bit of a blip in terms of increase. You could even also watch a recent Kashtira profile provided on my channel with Young Ho at Toronto Regionals who taught and also played like the Ken Gen stuff. It was like really funny in terms of some of the combos that he was showing. So definitely go check that out. And then another deck, Manadium, which, at one point, not that long ago, I guess a few months now, but was like in potential tier 1 conversation, especially when that ban list was first announced, which is really funny to think now, right? Considering how fast it's fallen. But when that January ban list was initially announced in December, because there were no direct hits to Manadium, people really had high expectations, myself included, for this deck. But really, especially in the most recent weeks, I've really completely disappeared. Initially, when with the Phantom Nightmare format, when that started, a lot of people were main decking Droll, but even that play has fallen, at least in terms of main deck play. But even then, I guess Manadium just hasn't really recovered in terms of representation. And then you have Labyrinth, which has been, in a way, a bit of a disappointment in terms of, you see that little blip up there where, before Phantom Nightmare came up, but after Maze of Millennia, where they got transaction rollback. And even then, at that point, a lot of people had high hopes for Labyrinth, especially again, it was another deck like Manadium, did not get hit in the ban list, but it actually, even before Phantom Nightmare format came out, it wasn't actually topping that many events, at least not to the level that people probably thought. And of course, after Phantom Nightmare, I think, people say that it has a bad Fire King like Snake Eye matchup, and it's really gone down in terms of representation. Will they come back? Maybe. You can't count them out either, but for now, definitely has disappeared. So now moving back to like the current format of the past couple weekends worth of regionals, these are some of the other decks that topped in that pie chart and the other section. You know, Chainburn, I think that's kind of funny, especially in a format where, as I mentioned, we've seen sort of the rise in these kind of like stun-like decks. And Chainburn, turns out apparently 2 Chainburn decks actually topped in the last couple of weekends worth alone. So, I mean, not the most fun to play against, but at the same time, I do think it's a little bit hilarious, and we'll cover one of the deck lists later in the video. Dragon Link still kicking around as well. Silent Manglade, I talked about this in the Rogue and Meta tier list videos, where, you know, it actually has back-to-back YCS level tops, and I think it's actually quite impressive and also deserves more competitive respect. Volcanic, the FTK version with like all the Snake Eye Horse, like it's like usually a 60 card pile, that has actually had some tops here and there, so this isn't necessarily all that surprising. And then moving on to just like the one deck each section. So you do have Black Wings, which is cool. It was played with like Bestial stuff. So Darkwing Blast, when that came out about a year and a half ago, they got their, you know, wave of support. You know, they could set up like that synchro that would burn for 700. Usually they would set up 2, I believe. And so in a tier limit format, it's a little bit of play. Obviously not at a high competitive level, but you know what, 1400 for every card kind of makes it hard for tier limit players to play, I guess. So it's cool to see this top even at this day and age. You have something like Evolzar. I honestly don't know what this deck does. It was featured, or rather mixed with like the Agdoitic stuff, which, you know, I think it came out in the early days of the pandemic. It was like reptile based, so, you know, Snake Grind, unfortunately hasn't really lived up to any kind of hype, if it even had any. And then you have something like Naturia that also saw completely absolute zero play, really, once like the Runic, rather they hit Sacred Tree to 1, and of course Runic got a little bit of a hit, but really not enough. Hopefully they hit Runic stuff more, and maybe Naturia stuff can come back again. You also have something like Raw Adventure Phantom Net. We're going to cover that later as well. It was insane. And then you also have something like Yubel, which we'll also get to, but that is definitely a deck that you should watch out for as we move towards Legacy of Destruction format. Now, in terms of the deck play style, of course, it can be a little bit subjective in terms of how you categorize certain decks, but really, you know, a lot of the Snake Eye decks are combo based, and so representation-wise stayed about the same since the last time I did this a couple of weeks ago, but most notably Stun, that has gone up, and I've, again, as mentioned, did a separate video on this, which is interesting because while I can't really think of it off the top of my head, since I've kind of started doing any form of event breakdowns in the last few years, this 6.4% is probably the highest we've gone in terms of stun category, so not the best to see. And then, of course, some of the packages that are played, Diabell Star, like Wanted, Snake Eye stuff, you know, it's still in most of the topping lists because, well, most of the topping lists are just happens to be, you know, Snake Eye decks, Fire King decks. But, you know, some of the other packages like Horus, Bestial, Runic, that has gone up a little bit at the very least. For example, Horus, unfortunately, a lot of stun decks actually also play Horus stuff, but most stun decks actually play Runic, which is where kind of like the play of Runic has gone up a little bit. And there were actually at least one or two, I believe it was in that last slide, where there were Bestial, Runic decks still topping at this time. We did kind of see that like right after the ban list came out, but before all the, you know, fire stuff, additional support came out. So, and the Bestial stuff, and this is talking about more so the actual package where you're playing like Regain and everything, and not just siding Bestials. So that went up a little bit as well. As I mentioned, something like Black Wings, they were playing Bestial. There were a couple of Dragon Link tops that of course play Bestial package as well. But if you think about like branded Despia, for example, at one point last year, there were actually a lot of topping decks that were playing Bestial packages. Nowadays, I don't think I've seen any branded Despia topping lists that are playing the Bestial package. And to quickly cover the sort of the overall deck cost, you know, this time around, median price was around $544 for among the regional level topping decks, which is a little bit of a decline since the last time I did this a couple weeks ago, and you know, the one prior to that actually was a lot higher, so at least we're still going on that downward trend. At the same time, this is still pretty expensive, of course, to play competitively, but you know what, the cheapest was this time around was Dinomorphia, about $100. It's kind of like stun focused oriented. The boss monster is like a Mystic Mine. You play a lot of traps. Usually trap cards are pretty cheap for the most part, so you know what, that's kind of like the low end. Volcanic usually becomes one of the more expensive decks to play because it's typically like a 60 card pile. You know, you already have all the expensive fire stuff, but you're also usually playing like some of the expensive horror stuff as well. And then lastly, just to cover some of the really interesting deck lists, obviously there's a lot of them, but you know, I'm just going to cover a few here. And this one was that blind second Chainburn I mentioned. I think it's really funny the fact that they're even going second as well. The Lava Golem's a nice little touch, which technically seems to be the only real going second cards. And there's, you know, some of the really classic cards in here too, like Just Desserts. I think this is one of the earliest cards I remember playing as a kid. I remember playing in like 2002, I believe, and you know, at that point we were playing anime rules. We were just kids. We were playing with just 2,000 life points, and basically Just Desserts would just be straight up FTK single-handedly during those days. Ring of Destruction, of course, got the Retta. That's not too great, and then you have something like Transaction Rollback, which I think is actually kind of cool and fits in along nicely. And the Magic Cylinder is also a nice little touch. Not that long ago, there was actually a Kashtira list that topped a regional with triple Magic Cylinder in the main deck. Actually, that had to have been some kind of bet, I can only assume, but you know what, I think that was also funny because I guess their like Flare Metal Dragon could burn, and then you have Magic Cylinder just to kind of clean things off. And then this is the other list I was telling you about, which is just absolutely crazy. Someone has to explain this to me because I don't actually know how it works, because I couldn't find a deck profile associated with this regional topping list. But you know, I thought it was really cool because they're actually playing some raw support cards, some of the newer ones that we've seen, and I was kind of rereading them again because it's been a while, and it's pretty cool. You know, they can search a monster reborn, and the chant card can actually, I guess, sort of gives it an anime effect, where the raw just gets the actual combined attack of the attributed summon monsters. Also, turns out Sphere Mode has an actual effect where you can special summon raw from like the deck. So that's something I never really realized, but I think it's really cool that this was able to top again. Hopefully someone can explain me the synergy with like all the Horus and Phantom Knight cards. I think it's just absolutely wild. And then finally we have Yubel. This is a list by Michael, who topped the Toronto Regionals, which is a very, very competitive event, and I'm happy for him because he was very close at the Niagara Regionals as well. And I believe during this entire Phantom Nightmare format, this is probably the second only Yubel list to actually top, at least that's publicly known. So, you know, super impressive. And of course, heading into Legacy of Destruction, this is going to be one of the decks to watch out for, as well as they're getting multiple cards as part of new support. And if you're interested in the deck profile, you can check it out on the one and only Team Samurai's YouTube channel. Anyways, guys, that was it for the regional recap of the last couple of weekends. Hopefully, this is the last of it for this format, and we get a new ban list soon. I'm really, really looking forward to actually getting some more new and exciting content. Anyways, in the meantime, a huge thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons and sponsors as always, and well, take care, guys.